get the recording going. Okay, so today we're going to finish up groups and teams. I haven't looked at the discussion boards yet that I said we'd do last night. I'll do that this afternoon. So basically today we were talking a little bit about groups and teams, and I said groups have a lot of properties like norms, status, size, dynamics, roles, and cohesion. And formal groups are part of the organizational structure, whereas informal groups aren't. You know, if you, by organizational structure, I hope you know what I mean. Basically, all companies have an organizational chart, or all companies of a big enough size. You know, once you get a couple 100 employees, you got to do stuff like this. So the idea of the organizational chart is that you've got reporting relationships. I don't know if you've seen this or not. So you've got reporting relationships. So the CEO is at the top, and then, the CEO has a bunch of reports, and they have a bunch of reports. And we'll talk about this when we talk about organizational structure. And the traditional organization is kind of a pyramid thing, but we've been getting away from that. And groups are kind of like the underlying gel that organizations formalize. So formal groups are part of the organization structure, while informal groups are not. They're equally important. If the informal groups are often more important, but on paper and legally, you have to take the formal organization very seriously. And if you are working in a firm that's structured in this way, you need to ask yourself, who in the structure is someone that I need to please in order to get ahead. So the structure kind of identifies who your customers are. Of course, if you have a business, then your chief concern is making sure that your customers are happy so that it will come back to you. If you're in a free market setting, if you're in a government agency, then you don't have customers exactly. You have politicians, really. The public is not your true customer, because if you work at the DMV, whether the person at the counter likes you or not isn't going to affect your career. What's going to affect your career is if the politicians like you. So basically, in that setting, you want to do the things that please the politicians. So basically, why do people consider them parts of groups? Self-esteem plays a big role. We connect with others because of roles. So relational identification. If you serve a community in some way, you start to identify with that community. You connect with others because of your role. You work with people in an organization, and then you identify with them. I mentioned the punctuated equilibrium model last time, and I also mentioned the alternative model: forming, storming, norming, and performing. People perceive themselves as having roles, and this largely drives how they act in a job. Some people will perceive their roles differently from others, and so they'll modify the roles. Okay. And I just got started, I think, last time talking about norms and conformity to norms. And this is a very important aspect of group behavior, which we'll talk about now. But first, I'll take attendance. If I can find the attendance sheet. Okay. So here we are, March 22nd. It's already the second day of spring, I think, or third day. Syed Abbas.
Here, Professor.
Hello, sir. Syed Ahmad.
Here, Professor.
Hello. Samima Akhtar.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Samima. Oops. Alessandro.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. David.
Yes, here, Professor.
Right. Annam.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Annam. Melissa.
Good morning.
Good morning. Winson. Ben Chen.
Here.
Hello, Ben. Kai Chen.
Here.
Hello. Ji Rui.
Good morning.
Good morning. Farhan.
Yeah, good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Brianna.
Here.
Hello. Steve.
Here.
Hello. Jonathan.
Good morning.
Morning. June.
Here.
Hello. Ming Hao. Who? Ming Hao who? Angelica. He's been sick. Jian Lin.
Yeah.
Hello. Leon Liu.
Here, Professor. Good morning.
Morning. Elizabeth. Elizabeth Maddox. Rochelle Mendez.
Sorry, I'm here, Professor.
Okay, Elizabeth. That's Elizabeth.
Yes.
Rochelle Mendez. Demi. Demi Mullings. Cameron Nahar. Cameron. Nicholas Neglia.
Here.
Hello, sir. Aquino Olivier. Jenny Perfecto.
Here.
Hello, Jenny. Shanil Pal.
Here.
Hello. Anna Siddiqui.
Good morning, Professor.
Oh, Anna, okay. Winjin Turabov.
Here, Professor.
I'm Winjin. Jaren.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello, Jaren. Yiwen Wu. Kristen.
Hi, good morning, Professor.
Good morning, Kristen.
Yes.
Is that Yiwen?
Yeah, USA.
Yeah, okay. And Anita Zhao.
Here.
Okay, and Jinran May. It's not, I think she dropped it. Winston here. Minhao. Angelica. Rochelle.
Here.
Okay. Demi. Cameron. And Aquino. Okay, chat. Minhao, who's here? Okay, so all right, so we're done with that. All right, so a couple of current events points before I start talking about conformity pressure. There's a Fed meeting today at 2. And it has, I think it's a 2 or 2:30. Pal's speech is, I think, at 2. Pal speech today. Yeah, now if Pal, I'm having trouble finding what the time is. I think it's at 2, but it may be 2:30. And okay, so this guy, let's see, CNBC. I'm gonna tell you the time. All right, it's either 2 or 2:30, and basically, he's gonna decide what to do with interest rates, and this is sort of, to me, this is like there've been a lot of big news things with this in the last year, but this is the biggest because basically, given the bank failures in the last 2 weeks, Credit Suisse almost failed, and you had, of course, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, and the Republic Bank almost failed as well. And the Fed, part of the Fed's obligation is to make sure that banks don't fail. So the way they're supposed to do that is by supervising the banks. Now, if the banks fail, there's going to be a serious economic depression if a lot of banks fail. So it's going to affect everybody. On the other hand, if if the Fed reverses course and reverts to the inflationary policies that have existed, then it's kind of signaling that we're going to be in a permanent inflationary economy, and you're going to keep seeing prices going up. My guess, and I have no idea really, he's still going to tighten, but I'm kind of thinking they might not, but I think they're gonna. So basically, I really don't know. I have no idea, and a lot of people are criticizing the Fed. Some politicians have sort of joined this choir that's always criticizing interest rate increases. And basically, the choice is this: you either see prices go up at the supermarket, and when you buy a car every year it goes up, and your wages don't go up as fast, and you're basically losing ground to inflation over the long haul, or there's a recession and a lot of people lose their jobs. I mean, it's a very unpleasant choice. And I really don't think politicians have much to say about it. Politicians are pandering to large numbers of people who really have no clue as to what the issues are. I'm not saying the issues are especially difficult. And if we had a competent mass media and education system, everyone would understand the issues perfectly well, because it's not hard. But people don't, because there's a lot of obfuscation. And so on the one hand, people hate it when there's inflation and they want the government to do something about it. On the other hand, they get nervous and upset when there's rising unemployment. If you understand that those are the two realistic choices, then you might say, well, we'll take slightly higher unemployment for more price stability. In the long run, it makes a big difference. The fact is, we have much, much lower unemployment here than in other countries. A student in my other class was saying that, we should be more like Sweden. But the thing is, Sweden's unemployment rate is over 7% currently. I'm looking up the exact number, whereas our in 2 years ago, it was almost 9%. Currently, it's over 7%. And basically, we really don't have that high an unemployment rate. So for us to sacrifice price stability for unemployment seems to me to be a rational choice. Now, of course, if banks start to fail, that's going to be a very serious issue. And so what the Fed needs to do is tell the banks to be more conservative in how they manage their reserves. But without getting too much more into it, I don't think we're going to solve that problem. But basically, if you do that, it'll slow down the economy a little too, which is probably not a bad thing, because by doing that, you'll counteract inflation, and then you won't have the rising gasoline prices and food prices and all the bad stuff that you've been dealing with. So I think it's going to be really, really important today what happens if he does decide, if the Fed does decide to pivot, they call it, like, in other words, pivot from interest rate increases to reducing interest rates or not increasing them. We'll probably start to, you'll see a sort of a run up in the stock market and commodities. And so you'll start to see higher oil prices, and the people who trade in this will react right away. So that'll just be the harbinger of more inflation. Wall Street, of course, loves low interest rates. I subscribe to a guy named Louis Navalier, who's occasionally on Fox Business and other business channels, and basically he is very, very pro a Fed pivot, reducing interest rates. These people don't really care about the price increases. What they care about is the stock market. Ironically, a lot of left-wing politicians agree with them for a slightly different reason, but the two are kind of allies. In other words, Wall Street doesn't like interest rate increases because it hurts the stock market, and the left doesn't like interest rate increases because it increases unemployment and causes government debt payments to rise, which reduces the amount of government authority. So basically, the two are kind of allied in this and a number of other things too. And so you're getting criticisms of Powell from both Wall Street and people like Elizabeth Warren. And so basically, Powell's he's either going to stand up to it or not, and we'll see what happens. And that'll affect what happens to you economically down the road. All right. So basically, the idea of psychological contracts is that firms make unwritten agreements between employees and employers that establish mutual expectations. And you used to see this idea of psychological contract, you used to see it more in companies. You see it less now, but the idea was that let's say you had a this is pay, and this is like the career horizon of an employee. We'll call it time. So time in a career. And so what you would have, if here. So let's say this is the market rate for a job. What firms would do is they'd start you off at a lower level and then over time raise you to a higher level. And the reason is that you would learn firm specific training. You would get firm-specific training, like how to handle the company, how to work on the machines in the company, or how to handle the office politics, how to solve task problems in the company, and so on. And as you learn this, you'd be more and more valuable to them, and they would raise your wage above the market level. And there was a sort of a psychological contract that you would get paid less in the beginning and then exchange it for higher pay down the line. And this, a lot of firms like IBM had this kind of setup, AT&T and so on, and it basically ended for many firms in the 1990s and 80s and 90s as corporations downsized in response to increased competitiveness globally, and basically firms make use of this to a lesser degree than they once did. Now, norms are standards of behavior, and basically all groups and organizations and societies have such norms. Okay, so if you look at our society, the laws can be viewed as written norms. And if you look at a company, the company policies can be norms. But it's also true that our culture has norms. So it's expected that as a student, you listen to the professor. That's a norm. It's a standard of behavior. And generally, because people seek acceptance and like to fit in, groups pressure their members to adhere to the standards of behavior that the group wants. And such pressure leads to behavior in groups that's entirely different from behavior by individuals. And the result of that is that groups can be very dangerous. Societies can be dangerous. Governments can be dangerous. That's where wars come from, and so on. And people behave a lot differently, say, if they're in an organization. It could be the military, it could be the police, who came under a lot of criticism 3 years ago, I think it was, because of George Floyd and other things. And basically, the norms of certain police organizations may not have been what they should have been. That's quite possible. So basically, all groups have norms, and whether the norms fit the outer reality determines in part whether the organization survives or not. So one of the norms of a company might be like, we think the economy is getting stronger, or we think the Fed is going to pivot. It could be things like that. And so the organization deals with reality by creating certain standards of behavior. This in turn leads to what might be called groupthink. And the idea of groupthink is that groups not only conform, but often go further and become obsessed with conformity. A guy named Janus, I think his first name was Irving. Let me just double check that. Janus wrote okay, so basically, Irving Janus wrote a book entitled Groupthink. And if you read the book, it's a great book, and he's mostly concerned with the Vietnam War, and a lot of it is arguing that the Vietnam War was largely a process of conformity pressure by the decision makers. Now, you're going to watch The Fog of War, which is about the same topic, and it's largely an interview with Robert McNamara, who plays a role in the book Groupthink. Of course, he was one of the major actors in framing the Vietnam War. Of course, he was basically a lieutenant, the Secretary of Defense. He didn't make the ultimate policy, but Janice starts out with a discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis, not the Cuban Missile Crisis, I always get them confused, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and how this inept decision, really self-destructive decision, was made because of this kind of conformity pressure. And so this idea that groups become obsessed with their standards of behavior and their beliefs. And if you question the beliefs, you get criticized. If you disagree, they will ostracize you. Basically, groupthink is associated with a kind of degree of paranoia that anyone who doesn't conform to the group norms is going to be thrown out. And this is a true danger, because if groups start to think this way, then they're not going to cope with reality. And if they're not going to cope with reality, they're going to make stupid decisions. And Janice shows that he argues that the Vietnam War was largely a product of groupthink. McNamara, in the interview, and he also wrote a book, basically argues that they made a mistake. It wasn't due to any kind of conformity pressure. It's simply that they made a mistake. But if you look at the nature of the mistake, it was stuff that anyone who studied the question intelligently would have figured out. So, saying, oh, well, we thought the Vietnam War was a product of the Cold War and had nothing to do with cultural issues within Vietnam, whereas the Vietnamese saw it as a civil war between different factions, and the North and South had always fought, and there were other issues, and that we didn't understand that the cultural ramifications of the Vietnam War, and that they had never trusted China, and they were never one country, and China wasn't a threat, and basically. The thing is, how do you not understand that if your whole life is spent studying foreign relations? And the people that were making the decisions were smart enough to have known it, and yet they somehow didn't know it. So I think just saying it's a cognitive failure, the fog of war, we just didn't understand. To me, it's not quite a satisfying explanation, but everyone's entitled to their opinion. But the thing is, what would have caused it then? That's open to question. So Janice basically says there was like a kind of groupthink, that there was this conformity pressure, that Johnson had followed a course of action, that the people in the decision-making group had decided on a course of action. They couldn't rethink it. Another commentator, David Halberstam, wrote a famous book, The Best and the Brightest, and he's a little bit like McNamara. He basically attributes it to stupid decision-making, that McNamara was obsessed with statistics and things like that. Uh, but basically, groups often make bad decisions because they're obsessed with group norms and because there's a high degree of conformity pressure. And there's little doubt in my mind that the Bay of Pigs and Vietnam were both examples. And he'll talk about, he won't talk about the Bay of Pigs, but he'll talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was actually handled well by Kennedy. So basically, I started talking last time about Solomon Ash's experiment. I think I did anyway. And Solomon Ash taught at Yale, and he was associated with another guy who did similar experiments, David Milgram. And I'll talk about both of them. They're very, very interesting and important thinkers. And Ash, I think I told you this, or at least I was starting to tell you this, that Ash had this experiment where he would have 3 lines, A, B, and C, and he would recruit 15 people or whatever it was to sit around a table. One of the 15 wouldn't know that the other 14 were part of the experiment, were Confederates of Ash. And he would tell the other 14 what to say. So they were collaborating, and the person being experimented on thought that the other people in the room were just like him or her. So basically, he would send a card around the table, and everyone would have to call out which line was shortest. And at first, they would say the right answer, and then they would all switch all at once. And Ash wanted to see what would the effect be on the subject if everybody else says that the wrong line is shorter. And what he found was basically that 30 to 60% of people will say the wrong line is shorter. So, I mean, this is fairly strong evidence that people will mindlessly conform to what others are saying. And if you've never met the people before, and just being put in a room with a group of people, and that's sufficient to cause a third of people to conform. And your book mentions that 75% of subjects gave at least one answer that conformed. The average conformer gave wrong answers 37% of the time. That if people will conform to that degree with strangers, imagine how it's going to be if you know these people and they're people you care about and you want to fit in. So in an organization of any kind, it could also be a political party or a union, whatever company, the conformity pressure is going to be extreme. All right, now Milgram took this a little bit further, and he was interested in the Nazi war crimes, which arguably occurred because of this kind of groupthink. And in other words, people didn't say, "I'm not going to do this because it's wrong." Rather, they do things in war. This is characteristic that people will do things because it's expected of them, even though in ordinary life they don't. So what Milgram did, and he ultimately became a professor at CUNY, incidentally. So Milgram would strap an actor. The test subject wasn't strapped. It was the actor would be strapped to an electric chair. And he would pretend that the chair was connected to a voltage regulator, and he would give the true test subject, who believed themselves to be a confederate of Milgram and his staff, but actually were the test subject. Whereas the test subject thought that the person strapped to the chair was the test subject, but the test subject, the person strapped to the chair was just an actor, and there was no electricity. It was just make believe. But they connected a wire to an outlet, and they gave the test subject a shock, and they said this is a low level. And then they set up a mock regulator, and it would be the kind of thing, you know, where they could increase the voltage with a switch. And at some point, it said the thing said danger. You know, it said danger. And then above that, it said XXX. And a guy in a white lab coat, and they varied how they did it. His book is entitled Obedience to Authority. It's a wonderful account of these experiments and how they varied them and tried different ways. And basically, he would tell the test subject that they were studying the effects of learning on memory. And his job was to, if the test subject gave a wrong answer, his job or her job was to raise the voltage. And so the actor would initially get a right answer or two and then get a wrong one. They were told to raise the voltage. And as they raised the voltage, the actor would start screaming. And what they wanted to see was, would the test subject keep raising the voltage beyond the point where it could kill the person strapped to the chair. Of course, the person wasn't really being killed. It was just a game, but the test subject didn't know that. And so he raises the voltage and raises the voltage, and the actor is screaming and starts screaming, and he says in the book that he asked a room of psychiatrists in a professional meeting, a psychiatric association, what percent of people do you think would give in? And they all said none, or 2 or 5. But in fact, between 30 and 60% of the people tested were willing to go past danger. Okay, so basically, what he found is that obedience to authority is quite common in society, and it can readily explain all kinds of heinous mass murder and killing and everything else. And so basically the idea is that people conform to group norms, and this has a huge effect on the kinds of choices people make when they work in organizations. Now, the idea of group shift is that there can be a change between a group's decision and an individual point of view. And generally, what happens is that when a group adopts a norm, people start virtue signaling, you could call it, that they have adopted the norm more strongly than everybody else. So within groups, discussions lead members to more extreme versions of the group norms, so that people can show how sanctimonious, how holy they are, because they've adopted these norms most of all. And so groups have a tendency to go in the direction of greater risk-taking. All of this speaks to that groups can be dangerous, but in fact, groups and teams are a much preferable way to make most decisions because they have assets as well as liabilities. And if you don't allow them to become too overwhelming, if you don't allow the disadvantages to become too overwhelming, the assets are often much greater than the liabilities. Years ago, a guy named Norman Meyer wrote a piece, The Assets and Liabilities of Group Problem Solving, and he argued that the problems of groups are the conformity pressure, that people, the conformity pressure drives out information. It causes people possibly to be more risk-taking or to have this kind of group shift phenomenon. But at the same time, groups have huge advantages, which is why companies like to use them. So groups have the advantage that, first of all, extreme errors are checked, because if you have multiple people working on something, they see if somebody makes a careless mistake or some kind of lapse of memory or some such thing, the other people in the group might catch it. More importantly than that, and that's important, is that groups pool the creativity of the members. And so if you have a group with diverse members, you get more information. And so there's more problem-solving approaches. So let's say you have groups of people from different departments, from different backgrounds, and you pool this information, you get different points of view, more information. That's why advertising firms use brainstorming and other group problem-solving techniques, because you get more information, more points of view, and this is going to enhance the creativity. I don't think the deepest kinds of creativity are enhanced by groups. For instance, I don't think Beethoven's Ninth Symphony could have been written by a group. I don't think the theory of relativity of Einstein could have been discovered by a group. But I do think that a lot of mid to high level creativity is enhanced by group problem solving. And if you look at that video I was talking about called The Edge of All We Know, it's on Netflix, which is about how both theoretical physicists and empirical physicists are working on the problem of black holes. And it's a fascinating story, and it depicts their problem-solving processes. And you can see in the case of the theoretical physicists who are, on the cutting edge of creativity and scientific insight and brilliance, that the group process does help them a great deal. So even there, now these guys are not making the kind of fundamental breakthroughs that Newton or Einstein made. So, but they are making important fundamental breakthroughs. So basically, for mid to high level degrees of, low to high level degrees of creativity, groups will often play a role. I don't think they help at the very highest level. And I think there are certain people who are really great at individual creativity and won't be helped by group problem solving. I was just watching last night a movie also on Netflix about David Geffen, who attended Brooklyn College for a year. He's from Brooklyn. He's on the Forbes 400. He's probably the most successful rock impresario or rock promoter or whatever whoever lived. He was incredibly successful, and you see in this biography how his unique creativity enabled him to succeed in multiple areas. And one of the things that caused Geffen to succeed was his remarkable ability to negotiate. And this came from himself. I don't think a group would have helped him at all. but I don't think he could have been successful without working with others. He was successful precisely because he was able to work with the rock stars and he was friends with them. And the way he became really famous was that the rock stars liked him and he liked them and he hung out with them. And whereas they were very creative and were, focused on the things rock stars focus on, he was a shark. He was a businessman, and he came up with the idea that he would treat them better than any of the existing record companies. He named his label Asylum Records so that his label would be an asylum for the rock musicians so that they could succeed better. And this worked incredibly well. He drew like a lot of the really important acts of the 70s. This made him a superstar, and other things happened we don't have to go into. But basically, I don't think this unique kind of insight would have been better had he did have a partner and he did pool his early ideas, but his creativity was unique. But all throughout his career, he did work with groups. And I think a lot of his success was because he did collaborate well. But I think also the insight was very individual at the same time. Okay, so basically, there are three sources of status in groups. How much power somebody has, the ability to contribute, and personal characteristics. And you can see in Geffen's story, all of this worked really well. That people describe him as a frightening figure. If you betray him, he'll destroy people. But at the same time, if you're allied with him, he'll do everything to help you. And there's countless stories that, the head of Columbia Records said that the rock stars, if they got thrown out of their apartment, they lost their money, or they had some problem, he would take them in his house. He would let them live with him. And he would give incredible amounts to them and do everything. He produced a concert tour for Bob Dylan for free, just to help them because he admired them so much. And of course, he later cashed in on it by having them produce an album. But basically, this kind of ability to contribute led to his having a great deal of power. And his personal characteristics were also going to play a very big role. So this is a remarkable figure. High status individuals tend to be less identified with groups. They're more likely to deviate from norms when they have low identification with the group and are better able to resist conformity pressure. So I think the great example of that is Henry David Thoreau, who lived in the 1830s and who rejected American society. He was the first hippie, in effect. I don't think he could have done it if he had come from a poor background. In fact, he came from a wealthy background. He ended up running his family business, which was a pencil factory in Massachusetts. And he was from an affluent background, but because of that, he wasn't afraid of rejecting society. And I think this is generally true. I mean, anyone can think this way, but I think a lot of people are intimidated by social norms. They think, oh, I have to fit in. I'm ashamed that, and so I have to seem like I fit in. And this kind of thinking causes a lot of people to want to fit into the group. Seeking to attain status in a group leads to speaking out more, using more jargon, criticizing, doing favors for people. So people will do a lot of things to try to gain status in a group. I never have. In my own personal life, I kind of gave. I never really cared. I don't know why. It's just my personality. But for a lot of people, conformity and fitting in is really important. Group size plays a big role in the formation of groups. Groups with a dozen members are good for gaining diverse input, but smaller groups are more trustworthy. Bigger groups are better for generating ideas. An important impediment to group performance is social loafing. The idea of social loafing is that individuals tend to expend less effort when they work in a group. So in other words, let George do it. I've got other priorities. The group will function just as well if George does it, so I'm not going to work hard. Let the other students attend class. I'm going to go do something else while the other people are in class. Social loafing is a bad habit. It's inversely related to conscientiousness. It's inversely related to work ethic. To avoid social loafing, the group should have clear goals. There should be intergroup competition. They should engage in peer evaluation. Rewards should be given based on unique contributions. With respect to cohesion, the idea of cohesion is that the group acts as a unit. The group spends time together, has a history, it deals with external threats, and so it adheres together. Small size encourages cohesion. Interdependence increases cohesion. Interaction increases cohesion. So groups that are tightly knit will usually function more effectively, and this results from spending time together, basically. As I said, groups have certain advantages. Group decision making has certain advantages over individual decision making, and that's why companies like them. Groups have more information, more points of view gives more information. There's increased diversity of views, increased acceptance of a decision. If you have everyone participating in a decision, they'll accept it more. I already talked about the chief liability of group problem solving, conformity pressure. Norman Meyer talks about the dominance of an individual. So one thing, a guy named Kenneth Boulding did a study years ago where he gave a problem to a number of groups. Half the groups, in half the groups, he planted somebody who was told to argue, call it a devil's advocate, was called on to argue with everybody else. So the other people didn't know this was a game that he was playing. So he plants these devil's advocates in half the groups. He doesn't have them in the other half. Then he gives a case study and he asks the group to write up a solution to the case study. And then he gives the solutions to blind referees who are experts, and he says, rate the solutions. And the solutions with the groups that had the devil's advocates were far, far better than the solutions of the groups that didn't have the devil's advocates. Okay. He then went back to the groups and he said to them, remove one person from the group. And the groups with the devil's advocates all removed the devil's advocates. So in other words, the person who upsets the group norms is going to be the one that's unpopular and is going to be, but that's the person that causes the group to do better. So basically, the issue of dominance of an individual is the reverse, that people will compete to get their way. Well, and not everybody cares that much. And so there'll often be competition, who's going to be the leader, who's going to establish the norms. And when one person gets their way, they then become dominant, and that drives out the quality of the different points of view from the group. Now, if you look at another experiment that he also did, that Boulding also did, he gave a case study to a bunch of groups and then gave it to them a second time. And the second time always had a better result than the first time. And part of this might be learning, but part of it is also that once the dominant individual gets their way, the group is better able to make a decision. So basically, part of the problem of a two-party system is that the two parties will always attack each other's solutions, whether they're right or wrong. And so if the majority is with one party, even if a solution is better, if it comes from the other party, it'll be rejected. So basically, this kind of dominant decision by dominance or decision by a dominant individual will often result in suboptimal decisions. Also, another problem is the social loafing, ambiguous responsibility. So groups have a lot of negative aspects, but the thing is that they can create more creativity. They can result in more creativity. So group decisions also can be more accurate than the average individuals, but they'll often be less accurate than the smartest individual in the group. So the smartest person can make a better decision, but the groups on average will make better decisions than the average person. Groups tend to be more creative than individuals, and they tend to lead to greater acceptance of decisions. They also take more time. What are some ways to improve group problem solving? A big one would be brainstorming, that the group kicks out a lot of ideas, doesn't criticize, builds on each other's ideas. Something like brainstorming is called the nominal group technique. Members record ideas via, say, email. Each member, okay, let me get this straight. Before the discussion, the members record the ideas. Each member presents one idea. All ideas are presented, and the group then evaluates the ideas without knowing who came up with the ideas. The members rank order the ideas. So basically, the idea of the Delphi technique, which is also similar, is that you share ideas without showing who's coming up with the ideas. Understanding different kinds of teams. Work groups interact to share information and make decisions. Work teams generate synergies, which means the sum is greater than the whole of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Problem-solving teams focus on solving problems, obviously. They meet regularly to discuss quality standards and improved patient care in hospitals and make recommendations. Self-managed work teams is a team of employees who autonomously implement solutions. Cross-functional teams are made up of individuals from different work areas. Virtual teams use technology to unite dispersed members. And multi-team systems use 2 or more interdependent teams that share a superordinate goal. Also important is the team context. There needs to be adequate resources. There needs to be a good leader. There needs to be some performance evaluation. Usually the composition of the group benefits from diversity. There will be allocation of roles, allocation of different preferences. A common purpose and motivation will lead to good group performance. There's always a wide range of roles in groups. These can include things like producer, shirker, critic. Should groups be rewarded as a group or as an individual? This is an important question. I once, years ago, I visited the Merck Corporation in New Jersey, and Merck is a pharmaceutical company. And I asked, one of the things we talked about was what kind of compensation system were they using? And they were struggling with a combination of team and individual incentives. And basically, if you reward people purely on the basis of individual incentives, they will focus on sales and they won't worry about their coworkers and they won't worry about servicing existing accounts. If you compensate a salesperson purely on the basis of the team, they will worry more about their coworkers and won't generate more sales. So what Merck was dealing with in terms of its compensation policy was balancing the extent of teamwork with the extent of individual compensation. And a lot of companies have trouble doing this, have trouble balancing how you compensate and how you reward. Effective teams will typically have common plans and purposes. They'll often be reflective and think about their purposes. The members share mental models of reality, so they're established group norms. Conflict, which we'll talk about later in the term, is okay if it's in moderation. So basically, groups will often conflict over roles, relationships, tasks, norms, and ethics. And a moderate degree of conflict will usually result in optimal outcomes. But the thing about conflict is you want it to be friendly. Conflict should be context-based. It should be not focused on personal animus, but on the situation. And so if you debate a course of action, that's good. If you attack each other, that's bad. And when I teach communication skills in my 3200 class, one of the things I talk about is the importance of focusing on the problem and not the person. So in other words, when you have a group process, you shouldn't attack each other. I've seen Brooklyn students do this a lot when I used to sponsor clubs and things. I used to advise clubs, and I would witness the students really attacking each other, and that's not a good thing. So you don't want conflict to be personal. You want it to be the optimal kind of conflict will be a debate about the situation and how to proceed, what are the pros and cons, and will not be of a personal nature. You can train people to share mental models and to develop transactive memory systems, which represent the ways in which members collect, integrate, generate, and distribute knowledge. In the case of the aircraft brake scandal, which you should have written about last night. As I say, I haven't gotten to it yet. I will grade it later today. You had a group that I would say is dysfunctional. You had an organization that was driven politically, that was conforming to people with power. Power was playing too big a role, and the result was that concern about making an impression on the client was more important than doing the right thing and optimizing long-term outcomes. And so basically this political process led to a high degree of dysfunction. You don't want that to happen in groups, yet it often does. So basically, I think the upshot and the kind of the conclusion, I think, about groups is that we all need to function well in groups. Functioning well in groups depends on our ability to work with others. It depends on our communication skills. It depends on the degree to which we can form. However, if we are to make a contribution to a group, we need to be able to question the group without alienating the members. This is in part the message of the Kenneth Boulding study that I mentioned, that if you're going to be in a group and be more than just a vegetable that conforms to everything and agree with everything the group does, you have to be able to develop really good interpersonal skills so that you can turn the group around if it makes a decision. I think the way that you do that is, first of all, the more you fit in with the group, the more influential you will be. So conformity to organizational norms is a prerequisite to being influential in an organization or in a group. So it's not just that you're high, well, part of it's that you're higher up. I mean, it's easier if you have positional power, you're higher in the hierarchy, it's easy to influence a group. But let's say everybody's at an equal level. What the general rule will be that those who conform to the norms of the group, those who conform to the standards of behavior, will be the most influential. So the trick is, number one, if you want to affect a group, the first thing is to fit in and to behave in a way that the other members think is right, that's appropriate. It's not the way society thinks is appropriate. It's not the way right-thinking people think it's appropriate. It's the way that the group itself thinks is appropriate. Second of all, if you want to change how they're making a decision, you need to think carefully about how you can use norms, the norms of the group that they believe in. How can you use their beliefs to modify the direction you're going in? And you see this in society, like the way that if you have a point of view that you want people to adopt, what you do is you frame the point of view in the language of the norms that the people already have. So the way to be persuasive is to understand the norms of other people, of the people you're convincing, and then frame what you're trying to convince them of in terms of their norms. And so to be influential in a group, you need to understand the group norms and then explain to your colleagues why a certain point of view will fit those norms and why they're violating the norms by making a wrong decision. Okay, so basically the people, Kermit Van de Veer and his colleagues who favored making the right decision at BF Goodrich, I think we're not good at understanding the organizational norms. And so they couldn't market their point of view to the hierarchy, which believed that they were going to make a sale and make a better impression by doing something illegal. And so what they needed to do was show that this was going to backfire. And they failed to do it. So they were unconvincing to the management. Now, in any organization, there are always going to be these kinds of conflicts. And so the trick is to master the norms of the organization. Years ago, William F. White wrote a book, Street Corner Society, about street gangs in Boston. So he was an anthropologist, and he chose to study, he lived with and studied street gangs in Boston as his doctoral dissertation. And the street gang had an organization just like any other group. And one of the key things he found is that the person who rose to be the group leader was the one that conformed most to the organizational norms. This is a very powerful insight. And so what he's saying is that if you want to become influential in society, if you want to become influential in your company, if you want to win over clients, you need to fit into their norms. If you look at, taking a very different context, I'll finish up with this. The David Geffen movie I was watching yesterday, I think it was called Inventing David Geffen. Part of the reason he was able to be successful and was that he fit in early in his career with the artists. So in other words, he went to live in Laurel Canyon on Sunset Boulevard, and he hung around with these rock people, and he fit the world, and he liked their music. And so he was, in a way, one of them. But, and so this conformity to them made them gravitate to him. And, Crosby, of Crosby, Stills and Nash, says, we needed a shark. We needed somebody who could really fight for us and who was on our side. And we trusted him, so he was like them in that he shared their taste in music and he was part of their world, but he had that skill that they didn't have of being a business, businessman. And so basically he became extraordinarily successful in part by conforming to the group he was in. And this is the message of any kind of group problem solving, that of being successful, in a group, that you need to conform to the group. Okay, so we're out of time. I'll see you next time. And you still have a little time. If you haven't done the case, that write-up of the aircraft brake scandal, I'll probably get to it this afternoon. So you still have a little time to get to it. Okay, have a nice day, and I will see you on Monday. If you have any questions, stick around and I can answer.
Professor, did you take my attendance?
I believe I did. Let me see. I did have you marked present, Ming Hao.
Professor, can you check mine?
Okay,
I
I
will
didn't have
handle
you.
it, please.
Okay, Cameron.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Question?